Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Working Group 3 meeting for the Extended Day Ahead Market Initiative, which focuses on the greenhouse gas accounting and cost topics. I'm Brenda Corona, representing the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and I'll be providing support for this meeting. Today, our agenda, we will be having an introduction from Kevin, and then he'll pass it along to Anya for a verbal update from the CAISO policy team. Then Anya will pass it back to Kevin to introduce Callie Wells from Greenwell Consulting for her presentation on the proposal for novel greenhouse gas attribution baseline. And then it will be passed back to Kevin, who will be presenting the worksheet and open questions in unspecified zonal approach. And then if we have time, we will make sure Brian Jacobson provides a recap on the discussion. And then lastly, Kevin will go over the next meeting that's on Thursday for our Working Group 3. We also have Phil Penningill, who is the coordinator of the EDAM working groups, available to respond to any questions. There are a few meeting reminders for this meeting is that it's intended to be collaborative, and we encourage you to ask questions and share your perspective on the topic. Feel free to raise your hand at any time, and Kevin will call on you. Once your line is unmuted, please start by stating your name and affiliation. After you're done speaking, your line will be muted, and please put your hand down on the virtual raise hand icon. These meetings are recorded and will be posted to video files to the corresponding working group webpage and other related materials. And any recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you do have any follow-up questions after this meeting, please submit them through the inquiry link located on the resource slide at the end of the presentation. And also we have a planned meeting this week to participate in the EDAM working group. Now I'll go ahead and pass it to Kevin. He'll go over his slide.
Hey everyone, welcome to Working Group 3. I'm Kevin Head, facilitator for this working group. And I think Brenda did a good job outlining the agenda for today. I wanted to use just 5-10 minutes to take a little bit of a stock of where we are and where we've been in the working group. And then I'll kick it over to Anya Gilbert from the CAISO policy team. And then we'll proceed with the rest of the meeting. What you see up here is what I kind of view as the path that we've gone down together in this working group. And it's broken into roughly 6 sections, depending on, which week we're talking about. And, just starting with weeks 1 and 2. So this is when we provided construction for the foundations of the working groups. We did this by providing some high-level background on how the WEIM works, the concept of market optimization based on bid-in costs, and the various greenhouse gas programs in the Western United States. We then defined what we considered to be the initial scope of the working group. We worked on that together. And then we also, as a team, prepared some design objectives against which we could compare that whichever approach or both approaches that we started to craft. Then we moved on to hearing about the version 1.0s of the 2 approaches. And these would really become the central focus of the working group. We heard from George Angelidis from the California ISO on the resource-specific approach, which was broadly an extension of the WEIM's model, where costs are bid in via a greenhouse gas bid adder, and then the market deems or attributes energy to having served the GHG zone. We also heard from Jeff Spires from PowerX and Mary Linke from Public Generating Pool, who presented the concept of the unspecified or zonal approach. And this was a different approach that instead relies on the price differentials between the GHG and non-GHG zone. And if that price differential was sufficiently low, or rather sufficiently high, then the transfers would be allowed to occur. And after that, we took a little time to hear from outside perspectives. This helped us understand more about the design of the 2 states' greenhouse gas programs, namely Washington and California, and how they might interact or constrain the potential market designs based on, the program design or the timing of when those programs are going to go into effect. We also heard about how an all-generation tracking system might intersect with the EDAM market design from Vijay Saptial from Western Resource Advocates. We then had a little bit of time where we could check in to revisit some of those foundations that we had laid and see if we needed to update that scoping document. We did this by gathering those homework responses. We got 75 responses from over 10 entities, understanding what the broader stakeholder community's open questions were. We then took those questions and revised the scope document that we had put together at the inception of the working group. And this would really be the frame for the rest of the working groups. So after we had that revised scope document, we started to fill it in and build it based on the version 2.0 approaches that were presented for the resource-specific and unspecified approach. I'm not going to go into the details of what those two approaches are, or at least were in the version 2.0, because the summaries are posted on the working group website, and I encourage folks to check those out. But we did hear from the California ISO again on the resource-specific approach, and the main change in that proposal was the revision to the baseline greenhouse gas attribution, which was originally proposed to be the RUC D+1 results, and instead the proposal was to use the results from this RSE optimization that started to gain traction from a different working group. We also heard about the version 2.0 of the unspecified or zonal approach, and a few clarifications were offered in that approach. So for example, it was offered that the approach intended for the greenhouse gas compliance obligations arising from the situation where the non-GHG zone serves the GHG zone. Those compliance obligations were intended to be allocated to the load-serving entities within the greenhouse gas zone. So that was a good clarification we heard. We also heard several options of how a source-specific pathway might work in the context of the unspecified approach. So then we prepared to close out the working group by one, performing an evaluation of the resource-specific approach. We'll hopefully have time to do that for the unspecified approach, but I'm not sure. And then we've spent a number of meetings workshopping some of the details behind the unspecified or zonal approach to close out some of the remaining open issues in that approach. So I hope this was a useful exercise and just a reminder of how much work we've really done, and where we have to go is really to continue workshopping that unspecified or zonal approach. And we're also going to hear a new proposed solution for the unspecified, or rather a certain aspect of the resource-specific approach, and we'll hear that from Callie Wells. So I don't expect anybody has any questions on that. If you do, feel free to raise your hand, and maybe I can take them after Anya speaks. But I'll turn it over to Anya Gilbert, who wanted to give a verbal update. So Anya, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Kevin, and good afternoon to everyone in the Greenhouse Gas Working Group. We're nearing the close, as Kevin outlined, and really moving from this working group phase to the straw proposal phase. And in light of that, and in light of some questions that we've received about the straw proposal and what proposals would be included, I wanted to kind of touch on that subject with the broader working group, since we've had some one-on-one conversations. So as you're all aware, we have had a robust discussion in this working group about the resource-specific approach, and more recently, we've had a robust discussion on the zonal approach, including how we can fill in some more of those details, which will be part of today's agenda. And I know that there's been a lot of work put into both approaches, including revisions to those proposals, as we're hearing today from Callie. So I recognize that there's work still being done and stakeholders are still evaluating each of the proposals. So I did want to clarify for this working group that both proposals will be included in the straw proposal as potential pathways. So really kind of open to questions if there are any on that front, but wanted to highlight that I've appreciated hearing stakeholder perspectives, recognize that there are merits to continue developing and evaluating both of those frameworks. And to that end, I would like to continue to engage with those interested in the zonal approach offline to help us to continue to fill in some of the gaps. And we encourage folks to continue working on this proposal based on recent discussions to help us more holistically evaluate those two frameworks. I did want to lastly end with, there is going to be an opportunity for stakeholders to share their feedback more formally through the straw proposal comment process. So that really was my key message, that both proposals will be included in the straw proposal. So Kevin, I'll turn things back to you unless there's any questions. Thanks so much.
Folks, if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'll give you guys a moment to raise them.
As a reminder, if you're connected to the computer audio or use the Call Me feature in WebEx, you may enter the question queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. If you're just on the phone line and not using the WebEx audio, please dial #2 on your phone to enter the question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question.
Thanks, Shreyas. So I see that Dan Williams has his hand up. So Dan, do you have a question for Anya?
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, Kevin. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Yeah, first, since I have the opportunity, thanks for putting together that slide you just went through. Just continue to be thankful and impressed with how you've been managing some of this process, and that was a helpful refresher there. And for Anya, I just want to make sure that I heard you correctly. I mean, one, just responding positively to both of these approaches being brought forward in the straw proposal. Appreciate the CAISO taking that approach and leaving that door open to continue to iterate on both. But just want to make sure I heard that if there are stakeholders who've been kind of deeply working on this who want to continue to provide some feedback to the CAISO as you're developing the straw proposal, did you say you were open to kind of doing some of that offline in addition to then the opportunities that'll be there once the proposal is actually published?
Certainly. I mean, there is a point at which pens need to come down in order to finalize the proposal, but if there are updates to the proposals themselves, I'd love to hear those updates or thoughts from stakeholders. Does that help, Dan?
Yep, it does, and I think that's a great approach. And again, just really appreciate how we're kind of closing things out here in the final week. So, looking forward to the rest of the meeting. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. I'm not seeing any other hands up, Anya, so I wanted to thank you for taking some time to raise that note and answer some questions. And anything else from you, Anya? Are we good?
Back to you.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks again. I will turn it over to Callie Wells from Gridwell and WPTF, and she'll give a presentation about a potential improvement for the resource-specific approach. And Callie, we've got you on the books for about an hour, and then and that'll include presentation time and Q&A. So as you want to take natural pauses, please just feel free to let me know that you want to raise questions, and I'll call on folks as they raise their hands. So Callie, with that, good luck and thank you for your time.
All right, thank you, Kevin. We can go ahead and advance the slide. All right, so as Kevin mentioned, I'm Callie Wells. I'm a co-founder and senior partner at Gridwell Consulting, and I'm here today on behalf of the Western Power Trading Forum. You want to go to the next slide, please? So the Western Power Trading Forum, or WPTF, is a broad-based industry organization that really advocates for competitive markets and transparent market rules throughout the Western Interconnect. So if we want to advance the next slide. So first, we wanted to thank the CAISO for giving us this opportunity today to really discuss our thoughts and ideas on GHG in the context of an extended day-ahead market. So today, we really want to tee up for discussion an additional resource-specific approach that we believe warrants consideration in this working group, primarily because it addresses a lot of the concerns that have been raised just kind of throughout discussions regarding the resource-specific version 2.0 approach. So we'll first start off with a discussion of more of a conceptual, high-level design elements of this additional resource-specific approach and kind of hone in on the differences between this approach and the version 2.0 approach. Then we'll discuss some of the case studies that we've been working on, and then wrap up with some key observations and kind of what we think the best next steps are for this working group as we progress towards that straw proposal phase that's coming next. So I think at this point, I'll plan to stop after topic 2. I think that's a natural break to have questions and some discussions, and then move on to topic 3 and 4. Okay, so taking a quick step back here just for a moment. So I think at the very beginning of this working group, everyone kind of recognized early on that when we're talking about GHG accounting and costs in the context of an organized central dispatch market, there really are 2 competing objectives here. And when you have 2 competing objectives, mathematically, it's very challenging and maybe impossible to reflect both of those objectives in an actual market optimization itself. So there really is no perfect solution, and I think that's something everyone recognized early on in this effort. So we find ourselves in this paradigm where this group is tasked with this challenge of having to come up with knowingly imperfect solutions to this problem, and identifying the pros and cons of all the options that are on the table, and then having to make an informed trade-off decision between all the options before we start kind of going down that path of what is GHG and EDAM going to look like. But I think at the end of the day, we all are really looking for that one design that has the best price formation and environmental solution while also minimizing the downside. So what is that option that has the most amount of pros to it with the least amount of downside or drawbacks to it? Next slide, please. So far, as Kevin mentioned, we've kind of talked about 2 approaches, the zonal approach and the resource-specific version 2.0 approach. So we're introducing today the 3rd option, which is the resource-specific version 2.5 approach. That versioning number is intentional, and you'll see very quickly as we go through the conceptual design that this is very similar to the resource-specific version 2.0 approach with a couple differences. The main difference is the version 2.5 approach does limit the deeming. So those megawatts of resources that are external to the GHG area that are flagged or identified as being used to serve load in the GHG area, this approach does limit that deeming to the incremental dispatch above a counterfactual baseline schedule. So this idea of limiting the deeming in this way has been brought up in discussions in this working group, I think a couple times. And the CAISO has correctly noted that when you do constrain the deeming in this manner, it does introduce some price formation concerns. So this approach, just like all the other approaches we've talked about, does have some downfalls, and this is one of the drawbacks of this approach. And we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail later on as we have one specific case study that highlights this drawback to this approach. But we do believe that when this pricing concern comes up, it really is most likely going to materialize in what we would call edge cases. But the key at this point is mathematically, this is a feasible solution to implement in the actual market optimization itself. But again, it is one of the trade-offs that this approach does have, and it's one that we as a working group should evaluate and weigh against the other options that are on the table. So WPTF, oh, sorry, not quite done with that one. Thanks. So WPTF at this point in time is asking that all 3 options should be evaluated and tested prior to the CAISO finalizing the direction in the straw proposal. And by that, I mean before the CAISO takes an option off the table or really starts focusing in on one market design option, we are asking that all of these be evaluated and tested. I know we've gone through some qualitative evaluation in this working group, but I think it's really through the testing that we can start putting some numbers and parameters around the pros and cons of all the options on the table. Because when I think about, how do you weigh various options, in my mind, I think about two factors. What is the severity of the drawback or the issue, and what is the probability of that issue actually materializing? So you can imagine there might be one design out there that has a drawback that maybe the severity isn't, considered too severe, but the probability of it actually occurring in the market is quite frequent. That may or may not be preferable to another design that has has a drawback that has a little bit more of a significant impact on the market, but it might not occur all that often. So it's through the actual testing that we can really start putting some numbers around these pros and cons to be able to make that informed trade-off decisions between the options. Okay, next slide. Okay, so for those of you who are more visual people, here is just a very illustrative example of the key difference between the resource-specific 2.0 and 2.5 approach with regards to the deeming. So the bar chart on the left is supposed to represent the supply stack of resources in the GHG area, and the bar on the right is the supply stack of resources in the external area. That red dashed line there is supposed to represent the baseline schedules of all the resources in the external area. So that is really the what would have been. What would have been the optimal or economic dispatch of the resources in the external GHG area to serve their own local load. So in that world without EDAM transfers, what's the economical dispatch of those resources? So as we've discussed here in this working group, the version 2.0 approach does have the potential to deem megawatts below that baseline schedule as being used to serve load in the GHG area once you allow transfers to occur. And when it does this, the market then has to go and essentially find another resource to dispatch up to kind of backfill for those megawatts in the baseline schedules that were then flagged as being used to serve load in the GHG area. So while this approach still does achieve the least cost solution, it does come at the cost of not accurately capturing the additional emissions from that backfill resources. So if we move to the next slide. So the 2.5 approach essentially limits the deeming to only megawatts dispatched up above the baseline schedule. So again, this is mathematically feasible to implement in the market, but due to how it has to be actually implemented in the market, this is where it starts to introduce what's called the non-convexity concern or issues that the CAISO has kind of noted in this working group. In other words, what that means is the market may produce prices that are not reflective of the dispatched energy bids. We believe that this is likely only to occur in what we would consider edge cases. But again, that's why we think that the testing is going to be very valuable in this effort, so we can really understand when and how often these edge cases arise, not only in this approach, but all the approaches. And to be clear, this edge case and this non-convexity concern does occur in our market today. The market today already has to deal with binary variables when it's making its unit commitment decisions or having to respect intertemporal constraints such as minimum runtime for resources. So it's something our market has to deal with today. The question here becomes how much more often will it occur if we were to introduce this type of deeming for GHG in an extended day ahead market. Okay, next slide, please. So as a working group, we are tasked with having to kind of make a decision on how GHG will be designed and managed within the extended day ahead market. So we are offering this additional approach for consideration alongside the other two approaches that have already been discussed. Gridwell has developed an optimization model to test this approach, and our preliminary modeling efforts have shown that it does address a lot of the key concerns that have been raised. with regards to the resource-specific version 2.0 approach. But again, this additional constraint that's needed to limit the deeming does have this drawback of having a impact on pricing outcomes. So, and just to be clear before we go into what more of the details of the version 2.5 approach, we want to be clear that WPTF at this point in time does not have a position or a preferred approach. And that is because without the testing, it is hard to determine upfront and in advance what is the best path to take. So again, just to be very clear at this point in time, we just think all these options on the table should be evaluated and tested before we make that decision. Okay, we want to go one more slide, please. All right, thank you. Okay, so we'll start with the design of the resource-specific version 2.5 approach. And again, I'm going to keep this more at the conceptual level, primarily because it is the resource-specific version 2.0 approach with two main differences. First one we've already talked about. It limits that deeming to the incremental dispatch above a baseline schedule. And then the second main difference is that when you're running the optimization that sets the baseline schedule, it reflects or it includes the internal transmission within the BAAs themselves. So from the beginning, all resources in the market will be identified as being either within a GHG area or outside of the GHG area. And then resources will submit hourly GHG bids as they do today in EIM, where the megawatt quantity reflects the maximum amount of megawatts they're willing to be considered deemed to serve load in the GHG area. And the price is the carbon cost associated with, if they were deemed delivered, that extra cost that they would incur due to the compliance obligation. So again, the megawatts each resource would be deemed delivered will be limited by the incremental dispatch above the baseline schedule and the megawatt that was reflected in its GHG bid. So it will require two runs, just like the resource-specific version 2.0 approach, the baseline run and the Ifm optimization run. We can go to the next slide. We'll start with the baseline schedule run. So this is an optimization run that's done prior to the IFM, and it sets that baseline schedule of all the resources external to the GHG area to kind of, again, that baseline schedule is supposed to reflect the optimal use of each of the resource as if it's dispatched to serve its own local load. So what would have been without EDAM transfers. And it would use the energy bids that were reflected to be also used in the actual IFM optimization. So we believe that the baseline schedule run should closely mimic the IFM optimization without EDAM transfers. So one approach could be to use the RSE optimization with energy bids that is included in the resource-specific version 2.0 approach. But at a minimum, we think that it also needs to reflect internal transmission constraints. And the reason we think that it needs to reflect the internal transmission constraints, and that's true if we go the 2.5 version or the 2.0 version, we think both of them should include internal transmission constraints in that baseline schedule run, because the point of the baseline schedule run is to set that optimal dispatch without EDAM transfers. And we all know that how resources are dispatched in the market on an hour-to-hour basis is impacted by transmission constraints. So the market's constantly having to dispatch resources around internal transmission to manage congestion. So if you ignore the impact that transmission has on the dispatch of resources, you're walking into the IFM with a knowingly inaccurate baseline schedule. So that's why I think it's really important that the baseline schedule run does include the internal transmission constraints. And then the output of the baseline schedule run then becomes those schedules for the resources in the external area that then become an input into the IFM optimization run. So next slide, please. So when you get to running the actual IFM optimization, this run would include a constraint that limits the deeming megawatts to the incremental dispatch above a baseline schedule. But very simplistically, this constraint is the IFM dispatch minus the deemed megawatts minus the baseline megawatts has to be greater than or equal to 0. In reality, when the CAISO goes to actually model this constraint in the market, it's much more complex than just a simple constraint. And that's why it starts to introduce those no-convexity concerns and price formation concerns that we've raised. But with this constraint in the market, the IFM is then able to dynamically determine the megawatts from resources in a non-GHG area that are dispatched up to serve load in the GHG area. And again, it's limited by the minimum of either the difference between the IFM dispatch schedule and the baseline schedule, or the bid megawatts that were reflected in the GHG bid. And then once resources have megawatts flagged as being deemed delivered, they will receive the GHG marginal price for each megawatt that was deemed delivered. So if we go to the next slide, there's some numbers, put some numbers around what we mean here and kind of compare it a little bit to the 2.0 approach. So if you have a resource with a 250 megawatt Pmax, and also assume that that's equal to the upper economic limit of the resource as well, it has a baseline schedule of 100 megawatts after that first baseline schedule run, and it's offered with a GHG bid megawatt of 200 megawatts. When IFM runs, if it's dispatched up to 175 megawatts, the max megawatts that the resource could possibly be deemed delivered to serve load in the GHG area under the 2.5 approach is 75 megawatts. It's the difference between the IFM schedule and the baseline schedule. Now, under the 2.0 approach, this resource has the potential to be deemed up to 150 megawatts as being deemed delivered to serve load in the GHG area, and that becomes the difference between its Pmax or upper economic limit of 250 and its baseline schedule of 100. But if you look at that 150 megawatts that it could possibly be deemed delivered and where it's sitting in terms of the IFM schedule, you'll notice that 75 megawatts overlaps that baseline schedule. So then the market is going to have to go find another 75 megawatts somewhere else to then backfill what this resource was originally being dispatched to serve in its local area. Okay, next slide, please. So just a few other features that this approach has, and again, these are very similar to the 2.0 approach, but just kind of wanted to note them here for discussion purposes. It is expandable to multi-GHG areas that are not linked. So if Washington were to implement their program and from day one it's not linked with California's GHG program, then this approach can handle the two different zones and two different carbon prices. We do see value. This is something that's slightly different than the 2.0 approach. We do see value in having all resources, including those within a GHG area, to bid their GHG cost separate from their energy bids. And the main reason being that if you end up with two different GHG regions that are not linked, we feel it offers a more transparent way for scheduling coordinators and market participants to reflect their bids in terms of their willingness to serve load in another GHG area if their resource resides in one GHG area. Similar to the other approach as well, resources that are not physically located in the GHG area but are contracted to serve load there can be modeled as if in the GHG region. And then this approach could also include or also consider including a constraint that or some sort of participation rule that better aligns the deeming with the ability to be delivered. I know this is a concern that's been raised throughout this working group, and the latest version 2.0 approach includes an additional constraint that limits the GHG megawatts based on the EDAM transfer. So this approach could also incorporate that if it's something that the stakeholders and working groups thought was useful to include. Okay, I know I ran through that pretty quickly, but I think I can stop for questions at this point before we get into case studies.
Yes, thanks, Kelly. That was great. Does anyone have any logistical questions about how this might work and questions about what was presented before we get into the issue of non-convexity and the case studies? Maybe just focus on the mechanics of how this deeming mechanism and this new constraint might work. So with that in mind, Alan Meck. Alan, would you go ahead, introduce yourself, and let us know your question, please?
Hi, Alan Meck, FPG&E. I think that maybe I just missed what you said because it was very quick. But what is the problem that you're trying to solve? Because it seems strange to me. That I would think that you would want to include all of the baseline as part of what gets deemed delivered into a GHG zone, wouldn't you? What am I missing?
So it's similar to in the EIM today, everyone submits their base schedule. And so the issue with how it's done in terms of the GHG attribution is it's that secondary dispatch issue where resources with a baseline schedule, some of those megawatts might be flagged as being served in the GHG zone. And so because the market runs a least cost dispatch, it tends to deem the cheapest and cleanest resources first as being delivered into the GHG zone, even though those resources would have already been used to serve its own local load. So it's really getting at that secondary dispatch issue, because then what the market has to do is go find another resource, and typically it tends to be another resource in the external region that's more expensive or has a higher emissions rate to backfill, and those additional emissions rates aren't captured in the GHG cost of the market. So it's really trying to get at that issue. It's something that the CAISO tried to address in 2018 in EIM, and that's how they came up with the one improvement that they implemented to limit the deeming in some way, and this just takes it one step further.
So I think there's something I'm still not understanding. If a renewable resource, let's just say, is part of your base schedule, isn't that being used to serve your load, presumably?
Oh, I'm sorry. So the baseline schedule only factors into the resources not in the GHG region. And you're trying to figure out how many megawatts of the resources not in the GHG region are being used to serve load in the GHG region. Does that help?
Yeah, but wouldn't you still assume that those resources in the base schedule are serving the load in the GHG region?
Not if they're external to the GHG region.
So I guess your assumption going into this is that those resources, even though they're part of the base schedule, they're not actually going to end up getting delivered to the GHG region. The market is going to redispatch to find some other more efficient resource?
Their baseline schedule is the schedule that they would get to serve their own local load without EDAM transfers. So if you're in a world without EDAM transfers and you're trying to figure out what was the optimal use of those resources to serve load in the non-GHG area, where would they have been dispatched to? And then once you allow EDAM transfers to happen, the market will re-optimize everything, and you're trying to figure out what megawatts in the external region were dispatched up to serve load in the GHG area.
But I'm still not clear on why you wouldn't assume that the base schedule resources are being used to serve that load just because they're outside of the region.
Yeah, so that's one of the issues with how the deeming happens today. It's been one of the concerns is that the market today automatically selects the cleanest and cheapest resources to serve load in the GHG area. But that does not then fully capture the total impact of emissions because of the GHG program in the entire footprint. So this is kind of one of the main concerns with how EIM does it today, and also how the resource-specific version 2.0 approach would also, it still has this potential drawback. It's kind of that key concern that we've been discussing in this working group.
Yeah, I thought that I had understood Jeff Spires' presentation, but maybe I hadn't. So why don't I just drop it here, and I'll try letting you go through your case studies and see if I'm still confused after the end of that. Thank you.
Okay, and happy to follow up offline as well.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Good questions. And I will go to George Angelidis from the California ISO. George?
Thank you, Kevin. Good afternoon. This is George Angelidis, California ISO. Hi, Callie. Thank you for this presentation. This brings up issues that we should discuss eventually to get a good understanding of all the possible ways that we can achieve the solution. And I'm going to hold most of my comments until you complete your presentation, because I know that we're going to have more discussion to do on the second part. I just want to clarify that this is not really a different methodology. It's really the resource-specific methodology that we have presented. It has some additional features, and two of them that, as you mentioned, so, you know, referring to other features like the last slide that you went through, I don't think it's useful. These features are all common to both proposals. They do have the same advantages of handling multiple greenhouse gas regulation areas, reflecting the true emission cost for resources. Additional constraints could limit attributions to BAAs that according to their exported energy. Obviously, they both can support the greenhouse gas pseudo-tie concept. So all of these are common. It's essentially the same proposal. The two elements that you bring up here, one was the internal transmission constraints. And if I understood that well, I think you were suggesting that the baseline schedule that is used here is supposed to come out of some optimization model that enforces internal transmission constraints. In our proposal, we're planning to use the optimal solution from the resource efficiency evaluation, which obviously is specific to a given BAA. We don't consider transfers except the bucket one transfers, of course, as we have said in the past, and we enforce our resource constraints, but we're very clear in that we do not enforce, or we don't plan to enforce transmission constraints in the resource efficiency evaluation. That's where we drew the line. So I'm not sure if you're crossing this line here and you still consider the result of the resource efficiency evaluation to be the input in the market for the baseline solution, because I think that would be seriously detrimental to the proposal, because it's something we cannot do. We drew the line there. Are you crossing that line, Callie?
You mean on the RSC optimization reflecting the
yes.
internal transmission?
Yes.
I think that the RSC optimization, or whatever optimization you use to set the baseline schedule, yes, needs to include internal transmission constraints. Otherwise, you have knowingly inaccurate baseline schedule.
Well, I don't know what baseline schedule accuracy means. We'll get back to that, but we have to be very practical about this. We can dream about anything we want, but we have to be practical when it comes down to implementation. And we are already running the Ifm twice for the market. One pass for the market power mitigation and the market pass after that. And we are running the resource efficiency evaluation optimization. We just put it in. Takes time now from the market sequence. This cannot be another IFM run with full transmission constraints. We just can't fit 3 IFMs in the market sequence. That's something we cannot do. So anyway, I don't want to debate this. I'm just saying the statement, and there's no reason discussing this anymore. I want to focus on other elements. You also mentioned binaries. Since we're going over implementation details.
George,
this is important, Kevin. We have to debate all these issues. Otherwise, we're not making progress. You have to let me.
We will talk about the binary complexity issue once she's gone through the case studies, right?
We already did. Yeah, there is a slide that referred to binaries. All right. And that slide essentially said that, correctly, that this nonlinear constraint introduced here as the other feature, okay, requires a binary variable to be linearized. Of course, yeah, this is correct. And, we're particularly sensitive to introducing binary variables in the formulation because they do have an impact on performance. And Callie very correctly mentioned that we are using binary variables already for the unit commitment conditions and all the intertemporal constraints associated with unit commitment. And there are other binaries too for storage resources and, for dynamic RAMs, MSG. There's a lot of binaries in the problem formulation. So I think the way I understood Callie's comment on this was, okay, we're introducing a few more binaries. It's not the end of the world, but again, we have to be realistic and practical. This is a binary that is introduced for every greenhouse gas bed. So potentially for every resource external to greenhouse gas regulation areas for every interval of the market. That is a lot of binary variables. It may have a huge impact on performance, but I think the issue that we want to discuss is not really performance. There are other more important issues, and we'll come back to that in the remaining of the presentation. I'm just addressing some of the concepts that were presented here so that we all understand them for the pragmatic impact to the implementation of the EDAM. There was another important statement, and I think this will be
George,
a good
sorry,
prelude.
the folks that have been waiting to ask their questions, and I hear your concerns about the binary variables and about the internal transmission constraints, but let's give other folks a chance to hop in, and then we'll give you a chance to ask those questions at the end here. But
it will help the discussion that comes up next. So.
Okay, thank you for that. And the next hand that I saw up was Kathleen. Kathleen, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, thank you, Kevin. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I want to thank Gridwell, the WBTF and Gridwell bringing this presentation forward. When we went through and did the evaluation of the version 2.0 the other day, I had raised some concerns that we were having. So I just wanted to get some clarity from Callie on the approach that she's bringing forward to see if a couple of the things that I had identified that we had some issues with, if they're still in this or if they're kind of a part of the enhancements, if that makes sense. Is that all right, Callie? Can I ask a couple questions?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, great. So one of our biggest contentions with not only this effort, but some of the other working groups has been that the baseline runs in order to be effective and to be accurate, that accuracy of the baseline, we have been making a really big deal for us. We think that that's critical for this to be successful. And so I think in one of the last couple of meetings, I brought up that our vision of an accurate baseline would come from an optimization run that uses the IFM, but replaces bid and demand with the forecast, takes out virtuals, so we're only using physical supply, and then blocks the transfers. I didn't hear you mention those other ones, but I was just wondering if you could speak to whether or not you think what you're proposing would be able to maybe consider that as an enhancement if we continue to discuss what the right line baseline optimization was, or if you had a different view on it.
No, that's actually a really good way to characterize what the baseline schedule run in this approach would be. And I think it's really through the testing process that we can kind of put some numbers around how accurate those baseline schedules, if you make those three changes you mentioned there to the Ifm optimization, would get.
Okay, that's really helpful. Yeah, I would love to see that kind of testing because it's been the linchpin on our concerns with the resource-specific approach being viable. And if that testing can be performed and we can show that a more robust optimization that's a decent representation of reality, of course, with all, the simplifications of the models we have, I think that would go a long way towards helping Vistra get over our hurdle. So I just wanted to give some feedback there and definitely support the testing. you know, and this is something that I think that this type of baseline run that you're bringing forward could be used to better perform the resource efficiency and to perform some other things as well. So just that really hit me, and it has a lot of merit, and look forward to considering that further. Thanks, Callie.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. Moving on, Mary Winky had her hand raised, and then I'll go to Mark Holman after that, and then I'll let Callie move into the case studies just so we can get through the presentation in the time we have allotted. So Mary, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. This is Mary Winky with Public Generating Pool. Thanks, Callie. I really actually appreciate the way you laid this out. It's really helpful. I just had a question. You know, one of the main issues that we've been raising with the specified approach has to do with kind of a fundamental issue just with the deeming of entities not having a lot of ability to manage where their energy is going, where their renewable energy is going, where their attributes are going. And I'm just wondering if there's a way, it seems like there's actually a lot of elements to this that are similar across the zonal approach. And I'm wondering if there's a way to enhance this approach that it does enable entities to have that kind of control over where their resources are going beyond kind of a bid strategy management approach. And I'm just wondering, even setting that aside, if there's not a way to do that in your mind on this proposal, how you're sort of thinking that entities may kind of manage through that issue with this approach.
Yeah, hi, Mary. I appreciate the question. So I've actually been given some thought to that as well. And as you mentioned, I think one of the ways would be through using bids to manage that. I think this approach, one of the enhancements when you limit the deeming above baseline schedules is obviously you could, schedule that your resource in a way that the baseline schedules get you to the megawatts that you don't want to be deemed delivered, knowing that any incremental dispatch above that could possibly be deemed delivered. Outside of that, I think there is other ways to enhance how those resources are reflected in the market to provide better control. I haven't fleshed all the details out on that one, but I think because this maintains like a resource-specific approach, there is that functionality. And I'm happy to, talk offline or flesh those details out at a later point. But I think this approach and possibly with the zonal approach as well could still have the ability to provide a little bit more control over that feature.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mary, for the question. We'll go to Mark Holman, and then I'll turn it back to Callie for the rest of the presentation. Mark?
Hi, thanks. Good afternoon. Callie, I thought the presentation was excellent. Really glad to see some of the brightest minds bringing forward solutions, and really happy to hear at the start of this call that the CAISO is going to remain open to having multiple options in the straw proposal, because I think that's critical. There was a couple things you said, Callie, around kind of principles and issues that I was really happy to hear. One is price formation and the importance of price formation. When I think about carbon pricing programs, whether it's cap and trade or cap and invest or a carbon tax, at the center of those programs is really that price signal. And it's about putting the cost of GHG emissions into the price of the product to send the right signals to develop, invest, and make available clean technologies. And so I think that's really important. And for us, it's a central issue, I think, to this topic, and where our concerns are so strong about the deeming we're seeing in the EIM and the deeming approach that's been proposed to date. Just as an example, we're looking at the public data out there, and so far this month, outside of the solar hours, the GHG shadow price is between about $5 and $12 per megawatt hour by hour of the operating day. yet we're seeing the transfers appear to be coming from incremental dispatch of coal and gas, and potentially a significant amount of coal. And when you get leakage, what happens is you lower the market clearing price because you're not accurately reflecting emissions in that market clearing price. Now, obviously, there's some entities that benefit from that lower market clearing price, but I think the intent of the program is to have those GHG emissions included in there. And I think it comes back to a couple callers ago where you were describing setting an appropriate baseline so that we're identifying the incremental dispatch. When I look at the current deeming approach, we're starting to get increasingly concerned, not just with an EDAM adopting a deeming approach. Yes.
Sorry. Is there a question coming up? I just want to make sure that.
Yeah, there is a question. There is a question coming up related to real time, and so I think there's two elements associated with Callie's proposal that are positive steps in the right direction that we see. One is that you're looking at incremental production. The current deeming approach does not tie the resources that are incremented in the EIM to those that are eligible to be deemed. So you can have coal dispatched and deem it to come from hydro. And we seem to see that the data is suggesting that's happening quite often. It appears that, Callie, your version is going to limit the deeming to the incremental output above the baseline. Did I get that correct?
Yes, that is the goal. And that's
Okay.
what we're seeing in our results occurring.
The question is, what would you do for the EIM once you implement that? So one of the questions I have is, do you have that same protection flowing through to the EIM, or would the EIM revert back to dispatching fossil fuel production and potentially inaccurately deeming base schedules, or would this carry through to the real-time market as well?
That's a great question. In my mind, I think that whatever comes out of EDAM would, for those resources that are also, in EDAM and then obviously in EIM, your IFM schedule would then set your base schedule in the EIM. And then for the resources or the BAAs that are not in EDAM, you would probably still have to have some sort of base schedule, but ideally this could flow through into the real time. I think there might be a question of the feasibility because that was something that was discussed back in 2018. But I think a lot of those concerns that were raised in 2018 are mitigated once you come into the day-ahead timeframe.
Yeah, I'm concerned that if you don't carry that through, you're just going to unwind the benefits in multiple areas. So even though you've run this base schedule run and then limited it to the incremental production, and I need to think through the implications of that more. If you didn't carry it through, we could still see Southwest thermals getting dispatched in the EIM and it being deemed to come from Northwest hydro base schedules like we're seeing pretty systemically today outside of the solar hours. I guess the second part is deliverability. It's good to see that you've at least made a note about deliverability. I think that's a topic that's been overlooked. My understanding of the cap and trade program is that for imports, specified imports, you need to deliver those to California, and the EIM, and I think to date, the deeming approach that George has been talking about doesn't seem to have any deliverability requirements. So we're seeing resources get deemed that really aren't realistically deliverable to California. And so putting in deliverability requirements is important. And then I think the last one Mary touched on, which is, can't stress enough how important it is to have mechanisms for entities to be able to control where their environmental attributes go and how much. There are multiple other environmental programs out there where entities need to be able to control where their clean supply goes. You know, as an example, under clean energy.
Thanks. Yes. I think we're aware of that issue, but it's auxiliary just to the Callie's presentation. I want to make sure that, we only have 10 more minutes left and she's got 4 case studies to run through. So understood on the.
Maybe I can make a suggestion that when we walk through these, we leave enough time for stakeholders to have a discussion about these topics in an open way, and we don't cut these conversations short and spend the majority of the time having, George explain his perspectives. I think some of that can go offline, or perhaps we can set up separate sessions for George or CAISO staff to present, but this cutting discussions short, I don't think is very helpful to robust stakeholder dialogue.
Well, thank you for that feedback, Mark, and I hope that you don't feel that the other folks that spoke before you didn't have a chance to raise their thoughts, but we will take that into consideration as we move through these working groups. So with that, Callie, if you had anything to respond on Mark's comments, please go ahead. Otherwise, let's keep moving.
Okay, yeah, so just in response, Mark, I appreciate your comments, and I think, and I understand all the concerns, and I think this approach does have the ability to address all of those. The details just aren't fleshed out here. So, in the next enhancement, we could consider addressing all those with more details, but I appreciate the comments.
And I'll just close by saying, really appreciate you putting the effort into this. I think there's a lot of good elements like there is to the zonal approach, and just appreciate the opportunity for stakeholders to bring forward their ideas and discuss and debate them. Thanks.
All right, thank you. All right, so moving on to the case studies. So want to move to the next slide. All right, so Gridwell developed an optimization model just to test the viability of this approach. And so we created a model with two different zones, a GHG and a non-GHG zone. And each zone has a combination of emitting and non-emitting resources with different energy and carbon cost bids. So we'll walk through kind of 4 case studies that we put together here today. The first one I'm just going to call our basic case. It's where you do get resources in the external region that are deemed delivered, and it ends up with price separation. And then case 2 and 3 show cases where you might not actually have megawatts that are deemed from the non-GHG area as serving load in the GHG area. But in some cases, the model shows that there is price separation, and in other situations there is no price separation. And so we'll walk through the viability of the price signal that you're getting in both of those situations, because price formation is a key point here, and I think it's something that when we weigh the pros and cons of all these options that we really need to take into account. And then the fourth case really is supposed to highlight that non-convexity concern that George was talking about earlier, because again, this option does introduce that issue. So we just wanted to highlight that here, walk through it, what does it mean, and then kind of get an idea of when we think that would actually occur. So I'll skip slide 19, or the next slide, sorry, just because that slide 19 just shows you the different resources that and how we had them set up in the actual model, if you want to refer back to them at some later date. So case study 1, I'll walk through this chart, how it's set up on this case study, and then the rest of the case studies are structured in the same way, so hopefully it'll be easy to interpret. But here on each slide with the case study results, we have a bar chart, and it's showing two optimization results side by side. The one on the left where it says baseline run, that is the optimal dispatch of all the resources if you don't allow EDAM transfers to happen. So this is that run that sets the baseline schedule for the resources in the non-GHG zone. So again, even though you see resources in the GHG zone with a dispatched megawatt, the output from the non-GHG resources, so the ones that start with EXT, kind of on the right side of there, those are the resources in that external area. That's what EXT stands for. It's the dispatch level of those resources in the baseline run that then set the baseline schedule when you run the actual Ifm optimization. So they will only have megawatts being delivered to serve load in the GHG zone to the extent they are dispatched up above that baseline schedule run. So again, the kind of on the left-hand side is the baseline run result. On the right-hand side is when you actually run the Ifm optimization and allow transfers to happen. So whenever you see a resource with a gray part of its bar, that shows the megawatts that are used to serve load in the non-GHG region. The blue bars represent the megawatts from those resources that are used to serve load inside the GHG region. So you will only really get resources in the external region, so the ones that have the EXT at the beginning. You will only see a portion of their bar blue when they are deemed delivered to serve load in the GHG zone. And then we have a little table up to the right. These are just some metrics that we find useful when evaluating the case studies, something that we're just suggesting, when the CAISO does some testing of the options. These are some, I think, metrics or statistics that we find useful that we can help make that trade-off decision, between the options. So what we have here is you see in the baseline run, the hydro resource in the external region was dispatched up to 400 megawatts to serve its own load. So when you allow transfers to happen, it is more economic for the market to dispatch that hydro resource up to 600 megawatts to then serve load in the GHG region. So you see an extra 200 megawatt dispatch on that hydro resource, and it's all blue because what it ended up doing is the market dispatched that resource up to serve load in the GHG region, and the internal gas resource, so the one that was INT gas, is dispatched down from what it was dispatched in its baseline run. So that extra hydro resource kind of displaced the megawatts that was originally being used from the internal gas resource in the baseline run. And so that's where you get the megawatts that are deemed from resources external to serve load inside the GHG zone. And the key here is that, again, that hydro resource is dispatched up above its dispatch level in the baseline run, and it's only those megawatts that are then being delivered. And so in this case, we do end up with price separation, and that's because when you look at the resources in the external region, the next most economic resource to serve another megawatt of load in the external non-GHG region is from that hydro resource at $10. The market will just keep 1 megawatt that it was being used to serve load in the GHG region home. And then the market will have to find another megawatt to serve load in the GHG region. And the next cheapest way to do that is to use the megawatt from the resource price at $46.13. So you end up with price separation in this case.
Sorry, you were cutting out a little bit. Would you mind just going back about 30 seconds and repeating it? Just it was cutting in and out.
Oh, no, I apologize for that. Thank you for letting me know. So I was just saying that you get the price separation here because the next resource that's economic to serve a megawatt of load in the external non-GHG region is going to come from that hydro resource. And the next megawatt, the next economic megawatt to serve load in the GHG region is actually going to come from an internal gas resource at $46.13. So that's how you get the price separation here. Thanks. In this case study. And so this is what I'm calling kind of the basic case study. So if we move to the next case study, this is where you actually don't have any megawatts that are deemed delivered and you end up without price separation. So I know this is a concern with the way EIM does it today, where the question is if we don't have any megawatts being deemed delivered to serve load in the GHG region, does it make sense for the prices in the non-GHG region to reflect a carbon cost? Because that's when you don't have price separation, that's the price signal that's getting sent out. And I know that's a concern with the way EIM results in prices today. What this is showing is that in some situations, that might make sense. And in this case, the reason you end up without price separation is because in that baseline run, all the resources in the non-GHG region are dispatched up to their PMAX. So when you allow transfers to happen, there isn't any additional unloaded capacity from those resources in the non-GHG region to be dispatched up above their baseline schedule to serve load in the GHG region. So from a price formation perspective, the next megawatt to serve either load in the GHG region or in the non-GHG region is going to come from a gas resource inside the GHG region. So you end up without price separation, even though you don't have any transfers, because it's the same resource that's setting the price in both regions, and it's a resource within the GHG region. So it reflects the carbon costs in both the GHG and the non-GHG region in this case. So I know I'm running through this quickly, but I know we're already short on time. So the next case study just shows when it does make sense to have price separation, even though you don't have any megawatts that are deemed delivered. So in this case, what's going on is you'll notice that the schedules in the baseline run is identical to the schedules when you allow transfers to happen. And what's going on here is that once you allow the transfers to happen, the market doesn't see any additional economic benefit from increasing a resource in the non-GHG region to displace a megawatt inside the GHG region. So you don't have any additional economic benefit from the transfers occurring from a GHG perspective. So you don't get any megawatts that are deemed delivered from resources in the external region. But in this case, you still end up with price separation, and that's because there is still unloaded capacity in the non-GHG region. So there is a resource that if there was an extra megawatt of load in that external region to be served, it could come from a resource in that region that would be cheaper than the next economical resource that would be needed to serve load in the GHG region. So in this case, you do get price separation. The GHG costs that are imposed on the GHG region do not flow into the non-GHG region under this scenario. All right, so the last case study, and it's probably going to be the one that we have the most conversations around, is supposed to highlight the non-convexity issue when you do limit the deeming in this manner. And I will note that in order to set this case up, we did have to change some of the assumptions in the model. So that slide that I kind of skipped over that shows the cost of the resources and the megawatts and their GHG bin megawatts, those assumptions do not apply to this case. We kind of had to force this case in because it really this edge case occurs when you walk into the optimization with not the most economic baseline schedule. But that doesn't mean it's an inaccurate baseline schedule. There are some real life cases where you could end up with a base schedule like this that we have in this chart. And that's when possibly this hydro resource here is not willing to be deemed delivered to the GHG area. So it doesn't have any megawatts that it could be dispatched up above its baseline for purposes of being deemed. And the external gas resource might be sitting at PMIN because of minimum runtime, for example. And so you have these two resources that have both a 200 megawatt baseline schedule. So when you allow transfers to happen with the prices that we used in this case, the market found it economical to dispatch the external gas resource up 100 megawatts to serve load in the GHG area. And from a cost minimization perspective, this is the right outcome. There's nothing wrong with the solution. But what ends up happening, and what's hard to see because you don't have the underlying assumptions on this one, is that external gas resource had an energy bid of $12. Energy bid, not energy plus carbon. But the resulting LMP in that external region is 10. So you end up in the situation where the energy price in that external region is lower than the energy bid of a resource in that region that was dispatched. So that's where you get this weird pricing formation concern, even though from a cost minimization perspective, this is the right outcome. So this is the concern that this proposal does introduce. The thing to keep in mind, though, is the next megawatt of load, the next megawatt to serve an extra megawatt of load in this external resource would come from that hydro resource at $10. So it's really the concern that the LMP ends up being lower than the energy bid of this gas resource. But that gas resource will get additional revenues for the 100 megawatts it was deemed delivered. So when you look at the total revenue stream that resource is going to get, it does cover its total cost. Just the LMP compared to the energy bid does not, line up with what one would expect out of a market optimization.
Hey, Kelly.
So I will, go ahead.
One quick clarification. You said the next megawatt hour or megawatt that would serve would be the hydro resource, and that would be $10?
Yeah, so the hydro resource had an energy bid of $10, but the reason it's not dispatched above 200 is because in this example, we said it wasn't willing to be deemed delivered.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thanks. I just wanted to make sure I had the number right there.
Yeah, and the load, I realized the load in the external region in this case was 400. So you had the gas sitting at P-min at 200 for some other, intertemporal constraint. And so the market only needed another 200 megawatts for that external load. And so it came from the hydro.
Yeah, thanks. And would you mind just sharing, at a later date, the inputs to this one so we can see how they differ from the case studies 1 through 3?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
So I'll just go ahead and real quick wrap up with the last slide, and then we can open it up for questions because I know I'm already at my limit here. So I guess the key takeaway at this point in time is limiting the deeming in this manner is feasible to implement in the market. So we think it's at least worthy of consideration by stakeholders and testing by the CAISO. I know there are some pricing concerns that have been raised with introducing another binary variable in the market, but I think the impact that has on being able to run the market is unknown until we do the testing. Because what we're seeing with our preliminary modeling efforts is it does address some of the price formation concerns and the secondary dispatch and leakage concerns that the current EIM approach has, and that the resource-specific version 2.0 approach would also have. So at this point, again, we think it's really critical to test each of the options on the table so that we can put some numbers around how often is this price formation concern or non-convexity issue going to arise. Is there really an issue with the processing timeline that this approach would introduce? And then also likewise with the other approaches that are on the table, it's only through testing that we're going to really be able to identify potential concerns that we need to think through when we ultimately decide which path to take. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Callie, very much. And I thought this was a great presentation. If it's all right with you, I might suggest that we just spend as much time as we need to vet folks' questions on this. And if we don't get to pivot to the unspecified approach workshopping that we had planned for the latter half, we could just pick that up on Thursday. Is that okay with you if we spend a little bit of extra time answering questions?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you for making yourself available. And of course, for the hard work here. So folks, if anybody has any questions or concerns, please raise your hand. The first hand that I saw up in the queue was Kathleen. Kathleen, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, no, great. Thank you. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. So I want to explore a specific concern that we've been talking about in these workshops. I do think it may be related to this final case 4. But so one of the things we've been talking a lot about is like, what is the appropriate impact on non-greenhouse gas areas and ensuring that we're being mindful of of the market design, not imposing a greenhouse gas regulation impact on the areas that are not subject to regulation. And I think some of that includes maybe one question that I have is about areas that are more under like a clean energy standard or may have specific entities within that area that have their own clean energy goals. For that kind of an area, I almost see this last scenario, Callie, is capturing it because they may not, the reason, I'm going to hypothesize, the reason this hydro resource is not willing to have any deemed megawatts is because it's a part of that area's clean energy requirement or it's a part of that specific market participant's own clean energy goal. And so they do not submit that bid. So in the context of that hydro is a part of that area's specific clean goals, while it may not be cap and trade, there is, that sensitivity to having that requirement in that area. So they do not allow it to be deemed by their bid. And I want to explore, when you're bringing up this impact, maybe go to case 4. So when you're bringing up the impact of the pricing, this seems very consistent with so as a part of the last few policies that got implemented, one of the sensitivities at FERC is that state regulations cannot be impose beyond the boundaries of those regulations on the other areas in order for FERC to be able to have been able to find a JNR. So when I'm looking at the pricing you have here, that hydro resource is not able to be deemed. It's the marginal resource in the external area. The external LMP is set by it at $10. That to me seems really consistent with FERC's expectation of how the market design would work and respects like if that area had that earmarked as a clean energy resource. Do you view this similarly as meeting the challenges of some of those concerns we've been discussing?
Yeah, I think it does provide that pricing signal and the ability for those resources that are in a clean energy standard or have that imposed on them to reflect that they aren't willing to be deemed delivered. I appreciate the insights there on kind of how FERC might view this pricing outcome. So yeah, no, I see that consistent with this approach.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that, because I know it's been really important to us also that the clean energy goals in the external areas be able to be respected. So I think this is a favorable case, and so appreciate you doing this more difficult one. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Kathleen. The next hand I see up is Mark Holman. Mark, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, Kelly, thanks again for these cases. Very, very interesting. Just a couple of thoughts, questions on what you've proposed here. The connection to the real-time and the EIM, this approach of limiting the amount that can be deemed to the actual dispatched amount above base schedule, could you leverage that? And if this was adopted, also apply that to the EIM for entities that aren't in the EDAM but have submitted base schedules? Was that clear in the question? I just want to make sure I articulated that well.
Yeah, no, I think I understood the question. Yeah, I think mathematically this could be implemented in the EIM and the real-time market as well.
And then I just coming back to my earlier question about only doing this day ahead. One of the further thoughts, it's the first time I saw it, so I'm just digesting it. It's really interesting. Just thinking through that if you didn't carry it forward to the EIM, for lack of a better description, you'd kind of end up in this two different frameworks with different price outcomes that could lead to unintended consequences, virtual bidding activity. Said another way, if the real-time market is deeming base schedules and dispatching one resource and deeming a different resource, but the day-ahead market is limiting it this way, does that make sense that we could raise some unintended consequences there if we don't keep those aligned? I think that's what we've been thinking about with the zonal approach, is keeping the day-ahead and the real-time market aligned so that you don't end up with gaps, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And I think, to the extent you would always want to align the day-ahead market with the real-time market as much as possible to the extent, it makes sense to do so. And I think if you don't carry forward whatever is implemented for EDAM with regards to GHG into the real-time, there are some potential unintended consequences. What those are, I'd have to give some more thought to, but again, I think through the testing, that's something that we can look at, and I think for all the options, we need to think through what the implications are if it cannot be carried into the real time, because I think, having the same treatment in both markets is always a good key component.
And then I think that I like the simulation idea for all the methodologies that are considered in the straw proposal, but in addition, I think there's some good data that's put out by DMM. Like I think in the annual report, they show what was deemed, and I think it's between 50 and 80% hydro and most of the rest being gas. It would be helpful to know how this would change that. And that's obviously a tough thing to do. But if we also had the data on what is actually being incrementally dispatched when the CAISO's importing as a BAA, and we compared those two, I think they did put out a little bit of information around, I think somewhere in the neighborhood of half of all deeming is going to base schedules, not to incremental production. It just helped us to try to get a feel as stakeholders a little bit more for how much of an improvement this would be in more accurately identifying the resources that are being increased in their output, being imported and deliverable, and then ideally even know what the price formation impacts are going to be. You know, how much would this correct some of the impacts that the leakage is causing to the market clearing prices and dampening the signals of the cap and trade program?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always a proponent for more data analysis, especially to support any market design element before moving forward with it. So I think that's, you know, and that your point about the numbers that DMM has in the report, I think that gets back to kind of what I teed up at the beginning, where when we're trying to make these informed trade-off decisions, we need to look at not only just identify the drawbacks of each of these proposals, but put some numbers around them. What's the, you know, the severity of the issue and the probability of it happening? Like how frequently will it actually occur in the market? And it's those two together that then help make kind of that weighted decision. So yeah, I mean, I'm all for more data analysis.
Completely agree and appreciate seeing multiple options out there. I think data analysis is something that I'm hoping we can expand upon, and that's really where I was going, is that, you know, what we're seeing in the EIM as a result of the algorithm causes us quite a bit of concern. We've expressed that concern about expanding it to the day-ahead market, and unless we can really be transparent about the data, about what's really happening, what resources are really being dispatched to serve those imports versus what's deemed, it's hard to evaluate the different approaches for pros and cons on how much they will fix the leakage, how much they will correct the price, and then also evaluate the potential for unintended consequences, including giving entities the autonomy to manage their other programs that others have mentioned. Thanks.
Yep, thank you for the comments.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And I see the next hand up in the queue is George Angelides. I realized that I cut him off earlier, so maybe we'll give George a chance to finish his question. So back to you, George. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Kevin. Maybe we can go to a slide that shows these gray and blue bars. We are interested in one that has a blue bar on top of a gray one, like this one, for example. Kelly, the main aspect of this modification of the resource-specific proposal introduces a constraint that limits the attribution, which is the blue bar, right, to be above the baseline solution, which is shown here with the gray bar. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay. So the purpose of this constraint is assuming that the gray bar represents the optimal solution for serving load outside of the greenhouse gas regulation area. Therefore, we want to demarcate that from the optimal dispatch of the resource and only allocate greenhouse gas attribution to the portion above it, which is the blue bar. Because presumably, in the current methodology, we allow attribution potentially below the baseline solution, as one of your earlier slides show with the bars. And that is linked or is leading to the idea that this causes secondary dispatch. What I want to say here is that there are two things that are happening simultaneously in the optimal solution. We actually optimize both the gray bar and the blue bar together simultaneously, which means that the gray bar is not fixed. It's still optimized because we do not know the optimal solution for serving load outside the greenhouse gas regulation area. The baseline is a solution for serving the load for a specific BAA outside the greenhouse gas regulation area, but without the benefit of transfers from other BAAs. So in reality, this resource may be expensive to serve the load outside, let's say California, so that I'm not repeating the greenhouse gas regulation area, speaking for the current status quo. And the optimal solution is for this resource to be displaced economically from another resource outside California that could serve load in this PAA where this resource resides more economically. So therefore, you could expect that the optimal solution for the gray bar would be below the baseline in this scenario. And then simultaneously, you also evaluate energy from this resource for serving California load. So although it is more expensive than other resources in serving load outside California, it's still economic for serving load inside California. So it can still get an attribution for serving load in California below its baseline, because simply the baseline is not economic for serving load outside California. So once we make this realization, then this introduction of a constraint here that assumes that this gray bar is optimal and then we're building on top of it, it skews the economics of the entire solution by providing an incentive to the optimization to actually increase the dispatch of this resource, which could be uneconomic in serving outside load outside California, just for the purpose of attributing dispatch above the gray line, above the baseline, to serve California load and offset higher costs for serving California load from more expensive resources. Now, why is the optimization doing that? Because the objective is to find an overall least cost solution for the entire market grid. So do we expect such a solution to result in a primal solution, a megawatt solution that is not consistent with the price? No, this is not going to happen unless we have this nonlinearity introduced here that essentially tells to the optimal solution, to the optimization model, look, you can schedule this resource that is not economic to serve load outside California. You can schedule it to serve uneconomically load outside California, because the added cost for that, it's lower than the benefit you get from attributing additional energy from that resource for serving California load, which results in an overall more economic outcome across the market footprint. So essentially, this artifact here introduced in the optimal solution, it compromises the optimality of schedules outside California for serving non-California load for the benefit of serving California load at a lower overall cost. So if you think about all this in this fashion, you will realize that this is not the edge case scenario, but it's really the case. This is exactly what we're going to do in the market, find an optimal schedule. So this introduction of the constraint here really changes that objective and allows a non-optimal solution for serving load outside, because it results in better cost solution for California load. And this is not something that we realize now. When we looked at this internally, both at the ISO and with other participants back in 2013, our XPG&E, we were looking at the possibility of enhancing the resource-specific greenhouse gas attribution methodology. This was one of the first things we looked, because it's so natural to think about this. Say, well, if we have a baseline solution, we're not limiting the attribution to whatever is incremental. But then we realized that doing that, it results in this outcome where essentially we compromise our overall objective for the market. So just the idea alone of this made us abandon this. We didn't think this was justified to sacrifice the optimality of serving load outside California just for the sake of California load. And then we had to really grasp with the cost issue, because the resource is not obviously scheduled in the money here. Its energy is scheduled outside its bid. It's extra marginal. It's paid a price that is lower than its bid. And that will require some side payment for this resource because this is not the resource's fault. This is an artifact that is introduced by our methodology for the greenhouse gas model. We don't know what kind of costs we're talking about, but this is possibly potential to happen in every resource outside California. It could be a large cost, and if we don't do anything about it, that cost will find its way in the neutrality for that BAA outside California and will hit the load outside California. Obviously, that's not correct because that load is not even subject to greenhouse gas regulations. It shouldn't pay anything additional than just its marginal cost for serving it. So probably what we'll have to do is extract this cost and charge it to California load because this is all done for the benefit of California load. Now, California load is already paying for the cost of greenhouse gas regulation as part of the regulation, and it also pays for the estimated secondary dispatch cost as CARB estimates it. All right. So now this will be an additional cost that we don't know how much it is. So when we considered all these elements together, we didn't think this was a proper way to implement the greenhouse gas model back in 2013 in EIM. But we had some additional concerns as well for EIM specifically. And when I heard Jeff asking the question, can this be applied to EIM? Which, of course, is something that everybody wants. We want to have consistent models between the day-ahead and the real-time market. But in EIM, there is an additional problem here that participants in EIM that are not in EDAM, they can submit any base schedule they wish. That base schedule, we simply validate it to be between the PMIN and PMAX, and that's the only validation we do. We assume it represents whatever day-ahead commitments the participant has made, but obviously this can be gamed here because the base schedule is really your gray bar in EIM. And this could allow a resource that is not economically efficient in serving load outside California to actually provide a base schedule and a greenhouse gas bid adder that will incent an optimal outcome where the resource is further dispatched above its base schedule uneconomically to serve load outside California, whereas it would otherwise be displaced by cheaper resources, just for the benefit of having this additional energy serving California load through a greenhouse gas attribution. So we didn't think that this was possible to be implemented in EIM specifically because of the gaming scenario that I just mentioned. For EDAM, things are better because the baseline is not something that can be submitted as input. We calculate it based on the resource efficiency evaluation, at least that's the current proposal, which is an optimal solution for that BAA, disregarding transfers, of course. So we don't know what displacement is going to happen in the market, but we calculate a baseline as the supply outside for that BAA that can serve the load. So it's difficult to be gamed because we're also using in the resource efficiency evaluation the same bits that the market will use. So I don't see that this is easy to be gamed in the day ahead, but for the real-time market, I think it's out of the question. So I'll let you, Callie, respond to this and others if to have a discussion. Let's make sure that we're all on the same page.
George, do you mind if I maybe just see if I can understand just summarize the points? So the first is the potential uneconomic dispatch, which is what Callie had identified, where a resource might be paid an LMP that's below their marginal costs, or below their bid-in costs. The second would be that case which was portrayed perhaps as an edge case might be more frequent than we think. Third would be that, if it does create this extra cost, we'd have to allocate that extra cost to load serving entities within the greenhouse gas zone, which are already getting, a number of other charges applied to them, And then fourth would be if we take this to the real-time market, it might create gaming opportunities that might not exist in the day-ahead market because the incentives are not the same between the day-ahead market and the real-time market. Is that roughly correct?
Kevin, you said it better than me. Yes.
Just wanted to make sure I follow. So, sorry, Callie, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, George. There was a lot to respond there, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll just hit on actually the points that Kevin just summarized there very succinctly. I appreciate that recap. So yes, the edge case, the probability of this actually happening, that's why we think it needs to be tested. We don't know how frequently this would actually happen, which is why, we can all sit and hypothesize all day long, but I think we really need to put this to testing so we can put some numbers around that. With regards to the side payment, in our modeling that we've done, that is not the case. I think it's important to keep in mind here that yes, the LMP for that external resource is $10 and its energy bid is $12. So if you look just on those two numbers alone, you would see that there is a shortfall there and there's going to have to be some side payment. But what this chart is not showing is that resource is also going to receive $36.13 for the 100 megawatts that was deemed delivered as the GHG revenue. So once you include that additional revenue stream in addition to its energy payment, all of its costs are covered. Anytime we tried to test that quite a bit, and anytime the model, that was not the case and the resource would not recover its full cost, the resource was not dispatched. So I think that was my response to the concern with additional side payment. I don't think that is necessarily a concern unless I'm missing something there. And on the gaming, I agree, George. I think once you bring that gaming issue into the day-ahead market, it goes away. I also think it's not necessarily a concern in the real time. And the reason I say that is because back from my days in DMM, when I think of gaming, there's two different factors there. It has to be persistent and it has to be predictable. So someone has to be able to predict when that's going to happen so that they can structure their bids in the way to influence the market and capitalize on that gaming opportunity. And it has to be persistent enough to where they're willing to potentially price themselves out of the market most of the time in the off chance of capturing that gaming opportunity. So I think I responded to all of those concerns. I'll leave that there and open that for other people to, if they have questions or other thoughts, I'd love to hear what other people are thinking.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I agree. And, I have a pretty short end summary. So, and Brian, I don't know how long he'll take, but I think we have time for a couple more questions. So the next hand that I saw up was Kathleen Colbert. Kathleen?
Great, no, thanks. I'll be really brief. I feel like I'm hogging the mic. So let me just quickly say that I think that two things. A, I think George just made a really good argument for why a zonal approach is something that we should probably prioritize. And as I've mentioned on one of the prior calls, it is the most theoretically and academically robust option because it does not give in to the resource-specific fiction. However, we are leaning in hard today on a path to success for resource-specific. I think that this is consistent with the objectives of the CAISO that we worked through in the beginning, and I think that there was interest from the CAISO on balancing precision with simplicity and feasibility. And honestly, right now where the version 2.0 is it's not something that can be supported because it is not furthering the objectives that we have laid out to be accurate and to not impose a harmful impact on non-greenhouse gas areas. This appears to me to be an approach that can balance those concerns that we've been discussing over the last 3 months. And so I don't disagree that there appear to be challenges, but there are many less theoretical challenges here than what we see in the version 2.0. And so I just want to be clear that if George is so set on not having inaccuracies or dealing with the fiction that the resource-specific approach brings, then I think we need to pivot and put all speed ahead focus on zonal approach, because it really is the only option to get away from this fiction. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. So I saw one last hand up, and that was Mark Holman Mark, you've got about 3 minutes, so if I have to cut you off, it's not due to anything other than timing necessities here. So go ahead, Mark.
I appreciate that, Kevin. First, I want to say the last two comments were just excellent. I thought that Callie's response to George was bang on. We support a lot of what she said in terms of response to those concerns. I also fully agree with Kathleen that the zonal approach is, in our view, the approach that shows the most promise because it accepts when deliveries are truly unspecified rather than, I think as Kathleen called it, the fiction. I want to come back to something that George said, and I think I heard it a few times, that the objective is least cost to California load. And I know he probably meant it broader than that, but I don't agree with that objective. I think the objective, some of the objectives we have are lowest total production cost, subject to applying the cap and trade or the carbon pricing program as accurate as possible. And I think we need to recognize the tension that is there, that the more leakage that the GHG approach we choose allows, the lower the cost to California load, and enabling resources to be deemed that aren't increasing their production, resources to be deemed that aren't deliverable. Yes, it lowers the price. As I pointed out, that we're seeing pretty low GHG shadow prices well below the actual GHG cost of the resources that are increasing their production. So the more you mute the application of the carbon pricing program, the lower the price you'll get for California load, but that shouldn't be the objective. It should be least production cost with as accurate of application of the carbon pricing as we can achieve, recognizing incremental production of resources, recognizing deliverability, and recognizing where we don't know and we have to use an unspecified rate. And that's why I really appreciate the last two comments. I think this has been a good session for having the dialogue and appreciate the opportunity to speak. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. I don't know if I heard George say that the solution would lead to like the lowest cost being paid by California load, but I think I understand the points that you were making. Maybe I saw that James had his hand up. Maybe James, did you want to fill in what I missed there? James Lynn. All right. Well, okay. Well, thanks, Mark, for those comments, and
Appreciate it.
will. Yeah. Okay. Well, Callie, great job today, and thank you for bringing this to the working group. And I thought it was an excellent presentation, and you handled the questions well. We look forward to engaging more on this. Definitely would be helpful to see the data set up for the case study 4. But let me just extend the ISO and the working group's appreciation for taking the time and effort that you had to do to get this onto the state that it's in now, and looking forward to continued dialogue on it. So.
Absolutely happy to participate. And obviously, if anyone has questions, my contact information is out there, so feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Brian, do you want to do a brief recap of what we talked about today? We can do something quickly and then kick it back to me.
Sure, Kevin. So we started with Kevin's recap of our journey so far in Working Group 3 as we wrap up this final week. Then we had some brief comments from CalISO policy team on a affirmation that we would, the intention is to continue to consider all the approaches that are on the table in the straw proposal development. And then also responded to a question that continued feedback after these working group sessions conclude is certainly welcome through the established channels, so reach out as appropriate. Subject to the timeline, constraints for development of straw proposals at some point, and you mentioned those would have to start to curtail. Then we had our presentation by Callie Wells on what is called the 2.5 approach. Fundamentally, the limiting of the deeming to the incremental dispatch above baseline, and then also internal BAA constraints considered in the baseline run. We had some initial discussion on the first Q&A session, some comments and concerns expressed on the implementation feasibility with respect to the binary variables and the additional market run from a feasibility perspective to facilitate the internal transmission constraints and the baseline. Then an affirmation that the similarity between the 2.0 and the 2.5 approaches, at least as Kathleen and Callie see it, as the baseline run would include, be based on the forecast, would not include virtuals and would block transfers. So that was affirmed to be the same between the two approaches. And then a consideration, a discussion, a comment on how the 2.0 would impact the EIM, how it would flow into the real-time market. That was touched upon in the second Q&A session as well. And then the final part of the discussion was on a Q&A on the case studies. I won't attempt to recap those comments. I'll attempt to put them in my notes. But it was a good discussion, and thank you. That's it for me. Back to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Brian. So, folks, for next meeting, our last meeting, which is exciting, we will be talking about the unspecified and zonal approach. The latter half of what I was hoping to use today's meeting, or latter third maybe, was to workshop some issues, and those issues are revisiting that question that we had about compliance reporting and settlements. We had sort of gained agreement on how we intended it might work in the unspecified approach, but we didn't reach a conclusion on how we might distribute the income to the load serving entities, the revenue gained from the hurdle rate. And then the next topic would be going back to the hurdle rate and talk about how that might be calculated, particularly in a situation where we have two divergent carbon prices, because we know as a constraint that upfront at the beginning of EDAM in January 2024, the programs in California and Washington won't be linked. So we'll have to figure out how do we calculate a hurdle rate that is reflective of the marginal costs of procuring allowances, while also being implementable in a solution where we just have one hurdle rate, or do we actually need two hurdle rates? And if so, how do we apply that? So that's what I'm hoping to talk through on Thursday. If there's time, we can revisit some of the open, unspecified, or zonal approach topics. I did see a note from Brenda from James, who was unable to speak. So let's see. So really quick, so James said George did not indicate that the objective was to have least cost solution for CAISO load, but that the edge case would result in a least cost solution for CAISO, which is not the objective. The objective is a least cost solution for the market. Okay, yeah, that's what I got out of George's comments as well. And I think Mark's point is also taken, that we want to make sure the carbon price is coming through clear. So thanks, James, for that clarifying comment. And thanks to everybody in the working group today. I look forward to continuing the conversation on Thursday. And thanks again to Callie for a great presentation. So have a great rest of your day, folks, and we'll talk to you on Thursday. Thanks.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using event services. You may now disconnect.